We've all heard it, right? Genes are the code of life, our biological blueprint.
Yeah, and the whole Human Genome Project really pushed that idea forward. Like, DNA held all the secrets.
Totally. It's a very neat idea. But, well, is it the whole story?
That's the big question, isn't it? It seems the reality is way more complex, more collaborative, maybe.
Exactly. So, is the gene this solo director, or is it part of a bigger ensemble? That's what we're digging into today, looking at sources that really challenge that simple gene-centric view.
And we've got some great stuff. There's this Eon essay collection, neuroscientist, genetic counselor, science writer, all weighing in. Plus, discussions from biology forums and some scientific papers, too.
Okay, so our mission is to unpack all these viewpoints. We want to get a handle on the selfish gene idea and, the alternatives people are talking about now.
Yeah, aiming for a richer picture, moving past that idea of, like, pure genetic destiny.
Right. Let's get into it.
Okay, so that Eon essay, Dead or Alive, an expert roundtable on the selfish gene. Robert Sapolsky, the neuroscientist, kicks off by saying, we tend to put DNA on this pedestal, like it's the absolute center of the biological universe.
And David Dobbs, the science writer, picks up on that. He argues that maybe gene regulation is the really crucial part.
What do you mean by regulation exactly?
It's the when, where, and how much a gene gets used. Think of an orchestra score. The notes are the genes, but the conductor deciding who plays when, how loud. That's the regulation.
Okay, good analogy. Because, your nerve cells and your skin cells have basically the same genes, right?
Exactly. But they do wildly different things.
And that difference comes down to which genes are switched on or off in each cell type.
Precisely. Dobbs uses examples like, a caterpillar turning into a butterfly, or even how new species emerge as places where this regulation is absolutely critical.
So it's not just having the genes, it's how they're orchestrated in context.
Right. Dobbs says the genome isn't some isolated holy grail. It's more like a collaborator with the environment.
Which leads to some pretty cool examples of how the environment actually talks to our genes.
Yeah, he starts small, like inside the cell. Say you get a buildup of nasty oxygen radicals.
Okay, bad news for the cell.
Right. So these sentinel transcription factors, like little alarms, sense the danger, lash onto the DNA, and basically tell it, hey, make more antioxidants.
So the cell's own internal state is directing gene activity. Makes sense.
Then he zooms out a bit to the body level, like estrogen.
Hormone, yeah.
It travels to uterine cells, docks onto receptors, and those receptors then act as transcription factors, turning on genes for cell division. So a signal from elsewhere in the body changes gen expression.
Okay, still internal signals, mostly.
But then he goes external. This example with the antelopes is wild.
Oh yeah, I remember this one.
The smell, the pheromones from another male triggers hormonal changes, boosts testosterone.
And that testosterone then affects muscle growth genes.
Exactly. It travels to muscle cells, hits receptors, switches on genes to build more muscle. Dobbs puts it pretty bluntly, the much vaunted genome inside that cell is being regulated by some other guy's pee.
Huh. Okay, point taken. External environmental cues directly influencing something as basic as muscle building.
It really drives home how intertwined genes and environment are. Dobbs basically says, it ultimately makes no sense to ask what a gene does, only what it does in a particular environment.
And he uses that grasshopper to locust transformation as the ultimate example of context winning out. Same genes, totally different creature depending on the conditions.
Yeah, the triumph of context, which neatly leads us to the potential problems with thinking genes are destiny.
Right. Laura Hercher, the genetic counselor in that roundtable, she talks about the dangers of genetic determinism.
She connects it back to, ancient history and literature, doesn't she? Oedipus, Macbeth.
Yeah, and even Calvinism, this deep-seated idea of inescapable fate. Your life's path is predetermined.
And she argues that while Richard Dawkins didn't invent that specific idea for biology, his book, The Selfish Gene, kind of fed into it for a lot of people.
How so?
Well, the metaphor itself is so strong. The gene as this lone engineer, the organism just a survival machine. She even quotes Dawkins calling us robot vehicles blindly programmed to preserve the selfish molecules known as genes.
It is a powerful image. And Dobbs admits the book is brilliant writing.
Absolutely. He calls it one of the most thrilling stretches of explanatory writing ever penned, but the critique is about that simplified take-home message,
And Hercher sees the real-world fallout of that simplification,
Right.
especially in her work as a counselor.
Yeah, she says we desperately need better ways to talk about this complex gene-trait relationship with patients, with the public.
She mentions things like incomplete penetrance
Right, where you have the gene mutation linked to a disease, but you just don't get the disease.
and variable expressivity.
Where people with the same mutation can have wildly different symptoms or severity.
The cystic fibrosis example really makes that clear.
Totally. We've known the CF gene for ages, understand the basic mechanics. But siblings with the exact same CF genes can have really different health journeys. You just can't predict it perfectly from the genes alone.
Which is so relevant now, with all the push towards personalized medicine based on DNA.
Exactly. Kircher's point is that understanding genes aren't destiny should be empowering, not paralyzing. It gives people agency.
But it also raises tough ethical questions, right? Like telling someone they have a high genetic risk for Alzheimer's when there's no cure yet.
Yeah, finding that balance between informing people and offering hope or support is incredibly tricky.
Okay, so moving beyond this gene-centric view, it sparked a lot of debate among scientists themselves.
For sure. The sources mention ongoing discussions about Dobbs's essay. Things like, what is a gene exactly? Which apparently is still debated.
Surprisingly complex, yeah. And some disagreement on how he portrayed William Hamilton's work. Some felt the core science wasn't that new to experts in epigenetics or epistasis.
You know, gene interactions and expression changes not involving DNA sequence changes.
Right. But Hercher argues that maybe those technical points miss the bigger issue.
Which is...
Finding that better language, communicating the complexity to non-scientists. That's the urgent part for her.
She did have a slightly different take on one specific point Dobbs made about genetic assimilation.
Right. Dobbs described it as a trait, starting out as an environmental response, then becoming hardwired into the genes over time.
But Hercher sees that differently.
Sort of. She argues that since gene expression itself is controlled by genes and environment, when genes eventually take over coding for that trait, it's still kind of the gene-centric view playing out. An extension, not a contradiction.
Interesting nuance. And there was that comment from the layperson reader in the roundtable, too.
Oh, yeah. That person was genuinely surprised that evolution could change locusts or bees without changing their genes first. A real aha moment for them.
It really shows how shifting the narrative can change understanding. And of course, Dawkins and Jerry Coyne weighed in, too.
What was their main point?
Basically, that regulatory genes, the ones controlling other genes, still fit the selfish gene model. And genetic assimilation ultimately does involve genetic change. So for them, it all comes back to the genes eventually.
Okay, so they see it fitting within the existing framework.
Pretty much. But Dobbs floated a more radical idea. What if evolution could happen without any initial genetic change at all?
How would that work?
He uses the example of stronger leg muscles. That trait helps survival. It could be passed on via genes for bigger muscles.
Okay, standard genetic evolution.
Or, he says, parents could just train their offspring to hunt better, leading to stronger muscles in the next generation through use, not different genes initially.
Ah, so the beneficial trait gets passed on, but through behavior or learning, not just DNA at first.
Exactly. He suggests that challenges the core idea of the gene being the sole unit of inheritance and selection.
Which ties back to why Dobbs wrote the essay in the first place.
Yeah, he said it wasn't really to shock scientists, but to reframe the story for everyone else. Emphasize the gene's sociability, its interactions, not just its selfishness.
And someone named Aga made that great point about experts maybe forgetting how lay people understand these big metaphors, like the selfish gene.
Definitely. Language matters so much in science communication.
Dobbs also pointed out how fuzzy the definition of gene has always been. Even George Williams, who set the stage for the selfish gene idea, used multiple definitions back in '66.
Like what?
Oh, like an abstract idea in population genetics, or a physical bit of chromosome, or just any hereditary info under selection. All in the same paragraph where he called it potentially immortal.
Wow. And apparently there are even more definitions now.
Yeah, Mark Gerstein found loads more in 2012. Dobbs's point is that science stories evolve, they change, sometimes they die. Maybe the immortal gene idea needs to evolve too.
Okay, let's switch gears slightly. Our sources also pointed to Reddit discussions on this. The term multi-level selection, or MLS, comes up a lot there.
Right, MLS. It's often framed as an alternative to that strict gene-only selection view.
Can you break down MLS for us?
Sure. It basically says selection doesn't just happen at the gene level. It can act on cells, on whole individuals, and even on groups, like kin groups.
So different levels of biological organization can be units of selection.
Exactly. And sometimes the pressures at different levels might conflict. What's good for a gene might not be good for the organism carrying it, or vice versa.
Okay, that makes sense. The Reddit threads also mentioned group selection versus kin selection.
Yeah, kin selection explains altruism towards relatives. The idea discussed was that sometimes, mathematically, broad versions of group selection and kin selection can look equivalent. And MLS seems useful for thinking about gene culture coevolution too.
Where our biology and our culture influence each other's evolution.
Right. But there's a counter-argument on Reddit too,
Which is?
that Dawkins actually did talk about kin selection and inclusive fitness quite a bit in his work, and that he wasn't a strict determinist, even calling genetic determinism a myth later on.
So maybe the popular interpretation of his work is simpler than the work itself.
It often is. The thread also briefly mentions punctuated equilibrium, the idea that evolution might happen in bursts rather than just slow, steady change. Another layer to the story.
And then there's Denis Noble, Oxford professor, pioneer in systems biology. He comes up in Reddit and a scientific article as challenging Dawkins' approach.
Yes, Noble is a major figure arguing for a different perspective. His systems biology approach emphasizes interconnectedness, multiple levels.
He has those 10 principles, right? Like biological functionality is multi-level.
Exactly. And crucially, biological relativity. The idea that there's no single privileged level of cause. It's more like circular causality.
Meaning things influence each other in loops, not just a straight line from gene to trait.
Precisely. He connects this way back to Aristotle's idea of understanding parts by the whole's purpose. The heart pumps blood. That's its function within the system.
Contrasting it with Descartes' more reductionist view of a preformed program. Fascinating how old this debate really is.
And Noble applies this in his own lab. They studied a traditional Chinese medicine, SKT, for muscle spasms.
Using a multi-level approach.
Yeah, looking at the whole organ, tissue, cells, molecules. They had this interesting hypothesis
What was that?
that maybe the drug works better in the pathological state, like when potassium levels were high during a cramp.
And did it?
It did. SKT had a much bigger effect at high potassium, even at doses that did almost nothing under normal conditions.
Wow. So the body's overall state changed how the drug worked.
Right. Noble argues a purely reductionist, molecule-focused view wouldn't easily predict that. You need the systems perspective.
And based on all this, Noble argues pretty strongly that there's no genetic program in the simple sense. And DNA isn't the only way inheritance works.
Which leads us perfectly into this idea of non-genetic inheritance. There's a PMC article specifically on its implications for evolution.
Okay, so what exactly is non-genetic inheritance?
It's essentially passing traits or environmental effects to offspring without changing the DNA sequence itself.
Like what kind of mechanisms?
It includes things like epigenetic marks, methylation patterns on DNA, but also stuff like parental secretions, nutrients passed on, hormones, learned behaviors, even cultural transmission. Basically, passing down the machinery that interprets the genes.
Okay. And the article mentions two types. Environmentally induced, like acquired traits.
And spontaneously arising ones. It connects to transgenerational plasticity, parents' environment shaping their kids' development.
And this can actually affect evolution.
Yeah, the article suggests it can change the speed or direction of adaptation. It might let populations respond to pressure even without the right genetic variation initially, and it can change selection pressures on the genes.
Are these effects always helpful?
Not necessarily. They give examples like acquired immunity passed on, which is good, but also potentially passing on pathological states, which isn't.
So there's a lot more research needed here.
Definitely. They call for more experiments, modeling multi-generational studies, but they also note it's really hard to separate these non-genetic effects from purely genetic ones over time.
So wrapping this all up, it's clear the story of genes, environment, and traits is way more tangled and dynamic than we might think.
Absolutely. Gene regulation is huge. The environment's influence is profound at every level. And now this non-genetic inheritance adds another whole dimension. It's definitely a collaborative process.
Yeah, the selfish gene idea was important. It gave us a starting point. But clearly, the scientific picture keeps evolving. Multi-level selection, the organism's role, the environment, it's all becoming part of a more integrated view.
Which really makes you think, doesn't it? If our genes aren't this fixed script, what does that mean for how you understand your own health, your behavior, maybe even our collective ability to adapt?
It's a big question. What parts of you might be shaped by things completely outside your DNA sequence?
We definitely encourage you listening to look more into epigenetics, systems biology, multi-level selection. The names and ideas we talked about today are great places to start digging deeper.
Yeah, absolutely. It seems the quest to truly understand life and inheritance just keeps getting more complex and honestly more fascinating.
It really does. It moves us away from easy answers, but towards perhaps a much deeper appreciation for it all.